In the winter of 1944, a 19-year-old soldier named Harold Clifton from Macon, Georgia, was handed a rifle he had never seen before and told to keep it alive. Not firing. Not loaded. Alive. The word came from his sergeant, a man who had spent time at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts before the war, and who spoke about wooden gun stocks the way certain old men talk about horses, as if the material had something like a will, and the job of the man who carried it was not to own it but to understand it. The rifle was an M1903 Springfield, its walnut stock already darkened by the hands of whoever had carried it before. The sergeant reached into a tin, pulled out a rag damp with a brownish gold oil, pressed it into Harold's palm and said, "Rub it in until it disappears. Come back tomorrow. Do it again. Then do it every week for as long as you carry this weapon." Harold Clifton never learned the name of what was in that tin. He went home after the war, found work in a cabinet shop in Georgia, and spent the next 40 years doing to furniture what his sergeant had taught him to do to a rifle. He died in 1991, the same year a fire started by the exact same oil consumed 3 floors of a skyscraper in Philadelphia and killed 3 firefighters who had no idea what they were walking into. This is a story about a substance that is simultaneously one of the most effective wood preservation materials ever discovered by human beings and one of the most consistently misunderstood fire hazards in the history of materials science. It is the story of linseed oil, which has been pressed from flax seeds for at least 6,000 years, which Leonardo da Vinci mixed into his pigments, which the British Royal Navy used to waterproof the hulls of its warships, and which today sits in a yellow metal can on the shelf of every hardware store in the Western world with a label that does not come close to telling the whole story. The flax plant, Linum usitatissimum, is one of the oldest cultivated plants on Earth. Archaeological evidence from a cave in the Republic of Georgia suggests humans were spinning flax fibers into thread as far back as 30,000 years ago. Before pottery, before agriculture, before almost everything. The plant is extraordinary in its utility. Its stems produce linen fiber, one of the strongest natural textiles ever used. Its seeds are eaten for their nutritional value, and the oil pressed from those seeds behaves in a way that no other common plant oil does. It dries. Not by evaporation the way water dries or alcohol evaporates, but through a chemical reaction with oxygen in the air, a process called autoxidation, which converts the liquid oil into a flexible, solid polymer film bonded at the molecular level to whatever surface it was applied to. This is the property that made linseed oil indispensable to painters, woodworkers, shipbuilders, armorers, and chemists for millennia. It does not sit on top of a surface. It becomes part of it. To understand what the armorers at Springfield were actually doing in 1939, and why it worked with a consistency that modern synthetic finishes still cannot fully replicate, it is necessary to think about wood not as a solid material but as a cellular one. Under a microscope, old or damaged wood looks like an aerial photograph of a ruined city. Rows of tubular cells, most of them collapsed or fractured, their walls thinned by the loss of moisture over years or decades. What people call dry wood is wood whose cellular infrastructure has been emptied, compressed, and weakened by the evaporation of the moisture that once gave it structural pressure from within. The wood is not merely cosmetically aged. It is architecturally compromised. A surface finish applied from the outside, a varnish, a lacquer, a polyurethane coat, seals the damaged structure under a film. It does not enter it. It does not restore it. The wood beneath continues to deteriorate, invisibly, under a surface that looks fine until it suddenly does not. Linseed oil, when heated to around 150 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit and applied to wood, behaves differently from any of those finishes. The heat reduces its viscosity dramatically, thinning it to near the consistency of water, which allows it to move through the wood's cellular structure by capillary action, the same mechanism by which water moves through a paper towel or coffee climbs the walls of a ceramic cup. It penetrates not just the surface cells but the cells beneath them and the cells beneath those. Once inside, it begins to polymerize, cross-linking its fatty acid chains into a flexible matrix that occupies the cellular voids and forms bonds with the wood's own lignin and cellulose. The cells do not just look filled. They are filled with a material that flexes under mechanical stress instead of cracking, that resists moisture ingress without becoming brittle in dry conditions, and that over repeated applications builds into a finish of extraordinary depth and durability. The rifle stocks produced at Springfield Armory under the hot dip protocol still exist in measurable numbers in collections and armories across the United States. Conservators who examine them consistently report the same finding. The oil has not migrated, separated, or degraded. It is still there, in the cellular structure of the wood, as intimately bound to the material as if it were always part of the tree. The walnut stalks are dense, close-grained, faintly golden in the light, and dimensionally stable in ways that stocks treated with modern synthetic processes are not. A firearm conservator at a major American military museum once described examining one of these stocks under magnification and finding the cellular structure so thoroughly saturated that distinguishing the original wood from the cured oil required instruments that had not existed in 1939. The Springfield armorers had accomplished, with heated oil and patience and a regiment of daily application, something that modern industrial chemistry has been trying to duplicate in a single spray coat ever since. The protocol they followed was not invented at Springfield. It was inherited. The U.S. Army's technical manual for rifle maintenance in the early 20th century drew on British military doctrine, which in turn drew on the practices of European gunsmiths going back to the 17th century. The British maintained the wooden furniture of their Lee-Enfield rifles with raw linseed oil applied by a specific method. A small amount placed in the center of the palm pressed against the stock, heat generated by friction and body warmth, the oil worked into the grain until it disappeared completely. The warmth mattered. The friction mattered. The disappearance mattered. An armorer who still had visible oil on the surface after working it in had not finished the job. The oil was supposed to go in, not sit on top. What remained on the surface was wiped clean, discarded, and the stock was set aside for 24 hours before the process was repeated. This was not ceremonial. Every element of the procedure had a physical purpose grounded in the chemistry of the material. What makes this military lineage remarkable is not its effectiveness, which was well understood. It is the fact that the same oil that those armorers trusted with the structural integrity of weapons going into combat zones was simultaneously, and for entirely separate reasons, developing a regulatory reputation on the other side of the world. The divergence between how professional tradespeople understood linseed oil and how the emerging consumer market was beginning to encounter it represents one of the more consequential knowledge failures of the 20th century. The problem was not the oil on the wood. The oil on the wood was fine. The problem was the rag. When linseed oil begins its autoxidation process, the same chemical reaction that transforms it from liquid into solid and makes it so effective as a wood finish, it generates heat as a byproduct. On a flat, open surface, this heat dissipates harmlessly into the surrounding air. The oil cures, the wood absorbs it, and nothing of concern occurs. But when the same oil saturates the fibers of a cotton rag, and that rag is folded or crumpled or placed in a pile with other rags, the geometry changes completely. The folded rag insulates itself. The heat of oxidation cannot escape because the same material generating the heat is blocking the paths through which the heat would normally travel. The temperature inside the rag rises. Higher temperatures accelerate oxidation. More oxidation generates more heat. The cycle feeds itself, building toward a threshold that researchers have measured at as low as 120 degrees Fahrenheit, the point at which linseed oil-saturated fabric can ignite without any external ignition source. No spark. No flame. No electrical fault. Just chemistry proceeding in an enclosed space until the material crosses its own ignition threshold and becomes, suddenly and silently, a fire. The technical name for this is spontaneous combustion. Fire investigators have documented it in connection with linseed oil since at least the mid-19th century. The scientific mechanism was formally described in peer-reviewed literature by the early 20th century. The relevant hazard was documented in trade manuals for painters, woodworkers, and floor finishers across multiple decades. And yet on February 23, 1991, a 30-story office tower in Philadelphia called One Meridian Plaza caught fire on its 22nd floor because workers refinishing surfaces in the building had left linseed oil-soaked rags in an improperly ventilated area. The fire spread for 19 hours. 3 firefighters, Lieutenant James Chestnut, firefighter Phyllis McAllister, and firefighter Deborah Wheatley, died. 39 others were injured. The building was so severely damaged that it stood empty for years before being demolished. The cause, when investigators finished their work, was listed as spontaneous combustion of oily rags. A fire inspector with the Montgomery County Fire and Rescue Service in Maryland later demonstrated the mechanism on camera for a local news broadcast, placing oil-soaked rags into a box in the configuration a homeowner might use after a typical floor refinishing project. Thermal imaging equipment tracked the temperature inside the box over the following hours. Within 60 minutes, the rags were generating measurable heat. Within 4.5 hours, smoke was visible. Within 6 hours, the box was burning. The demonstration required no props and no manipulation. The chemistry did exactly what the chemistry does when the conditions are met. The conditions are met more often than most people know. A family in Connecticut used a linseed oil-based wood finish on their hardwood floors, cleaned up the rags, placed them in a household trash can, and went to bed. A woodworking shop in Wisconsin burned to the ground in the middle of the night from a pile of rags left in a corner after a finishing session. A homeowner in Maryland had her house destroyed in 2014 when contractors left oil-soaked rags beneath a deck structure without adequate airflow. The East Sussex Fire and Rescue Service in England catalogued these and similar incidents and published guidance specifically identifying linseed oil-saturated fabric as a primary spontaneous combustion hazard in residential settings, noting that every documented case in their records involved the same single variable: a pile of oil-soaked material that could not dissipate the heat of its own oxidation. The National Park Service in the United States documented an incident at one of its historic facilities where a maintenance worker, following standard safety precautions and placing used linseed oil rags on an outdoor workbench rather than in an enclosed container, still managed to start a fire that spread to an adjacent structure. The outdoor setting was not sufficient. The rags had been left in a loose pile rather than spread flat and separated. The oxidation had already advanced past the point of control before anyone recognized a problem. The building that burned had survived more than 100 years. It did not survive a pile of rags. Against this background of documented incidents, the regulatory landscape that developed across the 20th century begins to make specific sense. The substance at the center of the regulatory concern is not raw linseed oil, the unmodified oil pressed from flax seeds, sold as a food supplement under the name flaxseed oil, found on the shelves of health food stores and nutritional supplement retailers across the world. Raw linseed oil is not classified as hazardous by most international regulatory frameworks. Its spontaneous combustion risk is relatively low compared to the modified forms of the oil, because the autoxidation process in unmodified raw oil proceeds slowly. Left on a rag, it builds heat, but the rate of reaction is generally too slow to accumulate to ignition temperature under normal circumstances. The product sold in hardware stores under the name boiled linseed oil is a different formulation. Despite its name, it is not simply linseed oil that has been boiled. Modern boiled linseed oil is raw linseed oil combined with metallic drier compounds, historically lead acetate, which was used in commercial formulations through much of the 20th century and which dramatically accelerated the oxidation process by acting as a catalyst. The addition of lead reduced the drying time of the oil from weeks to days and made the material far more commercially practical as a wood finish and oil paint binder. It also made the spontaneous combustion risk of oil-soaked rags proportionally greater, because the catalytic metal accelerated not just the beneficial drying reaction on surfaces but the dangerous heat-generating reaction in enclosed material. The movement to remove lead from consumer products that began in the late 1970s and accelerated through the 1980s resulted in the replacement of lead-based dryers in boiled linseed oil with cobalt and manganese compounds. These substitutes were considered safer from a toxicological standpoint. The spontaneous combustion hazard, however, remained. Cobalt and manganese catalyzed the autoxidation reaction by the same mechanism lead did, and oil-soaked rags containing boiled linseed oil with cobalt dryers behave in fire investigation tests essentially identically to rags containing the older lead-based formulations. They heat, they build, and under the right conditions they ignite. In the decades following the phase-out of lead, cobalt itself attracted regulatory scrutiny. The European Union's REACH regulation, which governs the registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemical substances across member states, expanded its monitoring of certain cobalt compounds in response to emerging toxicological research raising concerns about occupational and consumer exposure. Several Nordic countries implemented additional national restrictions on products containing cobalt-based dryers beyond the baseline EU requirements. Australia classified certain formulations under its dangerous goods transport regulations. Japan implemented labeling and use restrictions on specific metallic dryer compounds. The practical result in multiple jurisdictions was that certain formulations of boiled linseed oil became subject to restrictions ranging from mandatory hazard labeling to outright prohibition for indoor consumer use. The exact count of countries with active restrictions varies depending on how the regulatory instruments are classified and counted, but the broader picture is consistent. A natural oil with a 6,000-year history of use had accumulated enough regulatory complications, across enough different administrative systems and for enough different chemical reasons, that it now occupies a genuinely unusual position in global consumer product law. None of this information appears on the standard yellow can in a hardware store. The label names the product. It may include brief application instructions. It may or may not carry a spontaneous combustion warning, depending on the jurisdiction where it is sold and the specific formulation being offered. It does not explain the chemistry. It does not describe the mechanism by which oil-soaked rags generate heat in enclosed spaces. It does not tell the buyer that the same property that makes this product effective is also the property that has caused building fires, killed firefighters, and destroyed homes in circumstances where the person who applied the oil had no awareness that anything unusual was occurring in their trash can in the middle of the night. Harold Clifton's sergeant knew. The armorers at Springfield Armory knew. The painters and floor finishers and furniture restorers who trained under experienced tradespeople in the first half of the 20th century knew, because the person who taught them showed them the metal can of water where oil-soaked rags went, explained the reason, and made clear that the protocol was not optional. Knowledge of this kind travels through contact. It requires a person who already has it to be present at the moment when a person who does not is using the material for the first time. Industrial mass distribution of consumer products severed that connection. The can went on the shelf. The apprenticeship did not go with it. The material science community has not been silent on this. Researchers at universities and fire investigation institutes have published detailed studies on the spontaneous combustion risk of drying oils since at least the 1960s. Fire departments in multiple countries have produced public guidance, conducted demonstrations, and issued warnings specifically about linseed oil-soaked rags. These documents exist. They are accessible. They do not reach most people who buy a can of boiled linseed oil at a home improvement store on a Saturday morning, because the people who buy it on Saturday mornings are not reading fire investigation literature or regulatory guidance documents before they start their projects. What they are doing instead is finishing floors or restoring furniture or treating the wooden handles of garden tools. And if they have done some research before starting, they may have encountered the same restoration communities and traditional craft networks where the original knowledge of this material has been kept alive by the people who never stopped using it correctly. In those communities, the gunsmithing forums, the furniture restoration workshops, the Scandinavian building preservation organizations, the military collectibles groups where people still maintain 80-year-old service rifles using the protocols those rifles were designed for, linseed oil has never acquired a dubious reputation. It is regarded as precisely what it is, a material of exceptional capability and specific requirements, one that rewards understanding and punishes ignorance in ways that are, in the most literal sense, incendiary. The old military application schedule, once a day for a week, once a month for a year, once a year for the life of the object, is not an arbitrary ritual. It maps directly onto the physics of oil penetration and polymerization in a cellular material. The first 7 applications in the first 7 days are doing the primary structural work, penetrating the cells, filling the voids, establishing the polymer network. The monthly applications in the first year are consolidating and deepening that network as the initial coats fully cure and create pathways for subsequent coats to penetrate further. The annual application thereafter is maintenance of a finish that is already, by that point, bonded to the material at a depth no surface finish can replicate. The wood fed this way does not just look preserved. It does not crack in changes of humidity, does not split in temperature extremes, does not develop the dry gray surface oxidation that kills the visual character of old wood. It absorbs mechanical shock differently. It sounds different when struck. Woodworkers who have used these techniques describe the physical sensation of properly linseed oiled wood in terms that sound, to people who have not held such a piece, almost like description of a living thing. That quality is not mystical. It is the direct result of the oil's molecular integration with the wood's cellular structure, a process that synthetic coatings applied to the exterior of a surface cannot duplicate because they do not enter the material. Polyurethane, lacquer, shellac, and the dozens of proprietary wood finish products that line the shelves of hardware stores are all surface treatments. They create a layer on top of the wood that protects it from external moisture and physical abrasion. They cannot repair the internal cellular structure that has already been damaged. Linseed oil applied correctly does something categorically different. It enters the material, occupies its structural voids and cures in place. It is restoration, not concealment. The Danish and Swedish building preservation communities have understood this for a long time. In Scandinavia, raw linseed oil, not boiled, not modified, not combined with metallic dryers, has been the primary exterior wood preservative for historic timber buildings for centuries, and its use has never been seriously interrupted by the regulatory concerns that attach to the modified commercial formulations. Swedish building conservation guidelines specifically recommend linseed oil treatment for historic wooden structures as the most historically authentic and structurally effective preservation approach available. Manufacturers in those countries export raw and heat polymerized linseed oil products to woodworking and restoration markets worldwide, and the market for these products has grown consistently over the past 2 decades as interest in traditional building materials and natural finishes has expanded beyond specialist circles into broader consumer awareness. The distinction between raw linseed oil and boiled linseed oil is, in this context, not merely a commercial or chemical one. It is the distinction between a traditional material with a well-understood safety profile used by professionals who knew its properties and a mass-market consumer product modified for commercial convenience, stripped of the professional knowledge infrastructure that made its traditional form safe to use, and distributed to millions of people with a label that does not adequately describe what they are holding. The bans and restrictions that have accumulated around certain formulations in certain jurisdictions are not expressions of regulatory overreach against a harmless natural substance. They are the bureaucratic record of what happens when a material with specific hazard requirements is sold to people who have not been given the specific hazard information. The fires happened. The regulations followed. The label stayed the same. Harold Clifton kept his sergeant's instructions for the rest of his life. He taught them to his son, who worked in the same Georgia cabinet shop for 20 years. His son taught them to an apprentice who now runs a furniture restoration business in Atlanta and who uses raw linseed oil, heated in a small pot on a purpose-built burner, applied with natural fiber brushes rather than rags, laid flat and separated on a wire rack to dry, stored in a sealed metal can of water until disposal. He learned the reason behind every step before he took it. He can explain the chemistry of autoxidation, the role of metallic dryers, and the physics of heat dissipation in folded fabric without consulting any reference material, because all of it was explained to him before he touched the oil for the first time. His work, on pieces he has treated with this method, shows results that clients who have used conventional finishes consistently describe as unlike anything they have seen from a product sold in a can. The oil has not changed. The wood has not changed. The chemistry has not changed. What changed was the path by which knowledge of this material traveled from the people who understood it to the people who used it. And when that path was interrupted, the consequences were exactly as predictable as the chemistry that produced them. A material that had served human beings for 6,000 years did not become dangerous in the 20th century. It became dangerous when the 20th century decided that a label was a substitute for an education and a product on a shelf was a substitute for a teacher. The can is still on the shelf. The knowledge is still available in restoration communities and military history forums and traditional craft networks and the publications of Scandinavian building preservation organizations. What remains to be determined is whether the distance between those two places, between the can and the knowledge of what it actually contains, will continue to be measured in fires, or whether someone will finally decide to close it.